At what point does following your heart become a mistake? And who decides when that line has been crossed? What you're about to hear won't give you clear answers. It won't tell you who to blame or who to defend. It will only show you how something that seemed innocent became something no one could undo. You'll have to decide the rest. She was married, 58 years old, 33 years into a partnership that had produced children, routines, and the kind of stability that doesn't attract attention. To those around her, her life appeared predictable. Sunday services, volunteer work, Wednesday evening Bible studies. The rhythm of a woman whose faith shaped her weekly calendar. Her husband worked, provided, maintained the household with consistent reliability. Their marriage wasn't the subject of gossip because there was nothing to gossip about. It simply existed the way long marriages often do, functional, familiar, unremarkable. The preacher was 44. He'd been leading the congregation for 7 years. Known for sermons that felt personal rather than distant, for listening more than speaking in private moments. People described him as someone who made you feel seen, understood. He held authority, not the kind that demanded obedience, but the quieter kind that made people trust him with their doubts. According to what was later shared, their connection did not begin loudly. It formed quietly, through conversations after services, brief exchanges that extended slightly longer each time, through private counseling sessions, pastoral care that many congregants sought when navigating personal struggles. At first, nothing seemed unusual. She attended his counseling sessions occasionally, monthly, then more frequently. Other church members noticed only because her name appeared on the schedule board with increasing regularity. No one questioned it. Spiritual growth requires guidance. That was part of his role. Over time, those conversations became more personal. What once centered on Scripture, discussions about faith, biblical interpretation, the challenges of living according to spiritual principles, slowly expanded. Her fears surfaced. Her hopes, the parts of her life she rarely shared with others. She began talking about her marriage, not in dramatic confessions, but in small admissions. The feeling of being unseen, the sense that decades together had created routine but not connection, the quiet loneliness that exists even when someone is always present. He listened, offered perspective, reminded her that struggling didn't mean failing. That questions were part of faith, not evidence of its absence. Their sessions extended beyond the scheduled hour. 15 minutes, 30, sometimes longer. Messages were exchanged outside of scheduled meetings. Not inappropriate in content, at least not in any way that could be pointed to clearly, but personal. Conversations that continued between sessions. Discussions about doubt, purpose, identity, the kind of communication that creates familiarity. She mentioned him more frequently in casual conversation. His insights, his understanding of complex emotional issues, the way he could articulate feelings she'd struggled to name. Her husband noticed the change before he understood what it meant. She spent more time away from home, more evenings at church events, more weekends coordinating volunteer projects. When he asked about it, she described it as spiritual renewal, a season of rediscovering her faith after years of going through motions. He didn't press further. Marriages survive by allowing space. Or so he believed. If you've ever watched something shift between two people without being able to name the exact moment it changed, drop a comment below. Because what's developing here doesn't announce itself. It just grows. And if you're invested in seeing where this goes, hit that like button. The line they're approaching doesn't have warning signs. By the time 18 months had passed, something had shifted that couldn't be explained by increased church involvement alone. She smiled differently, carried herself with a lightness that hadn't been visible before, spoke about purpose and meaning in ways that suggested she'd found something she'd been missing. Friends noticed. Some celebrated what appeared to be spiritual awakening. Others felt uneasy without being able to articulate why. The preacher maintained his public responsibilities without visible disruption. Services continued. His sermons remained well attended. If anything, his presence seemed to inspire more engagement from the congregation. But among church leadership, quiet observations were forming. One elder mentioned that the preacher seemed distracted during administrative meetings. Another noted that he deflected personal questions with unusual care. A third observed that he and the woman were often the last to leave the building after events. None of these observations alone meant anything definitive. Together, they created a pattern that made people uncomfortable without giving them language to describe why. She began questioning her marriage, not out loud, not in ways that required immediate action, but internally, in the private spaces where thoughts form before they become decisions. She wondered whether staying meant suppressing something she felt was real, whether decades of commitment could justify continuing something that no longer felt alive, whether honoring a vow made 33 years ago required ignoring what she was feeling now. The questions multiplied. Was it wrong to want connection that felt genuine rather than obligatory? Was it selfish to consider her own emotional needs after years of prioritizing stability? Was it possible that leaving could be honesty rather than betrayal? No clear answers emerged, only more questions. Her husband sensed the distance growing but couldn't identify its source. Conversations became shorter. Physical closeness decreased. She seemed present but not engaged, as though part of her attention existed elsewhere, even when they occupied the same room. He asked if something was wrong. She said no, said she was fine, just processing some things spiritually. He wanted to believe her. Believing her was easier than confronting what doubt would require him to face. The preacher's behavior remained difficult to categorize. He continued providing pastoral care, continued being available for counseling, continued maintaining the boundaries that technically existed, never crossing lines that could be definitively identified as inappropriate. But the familiarity between them had deepened in ways that made observers uneasy. They spoke in shorthand, finished each other's sentences, shared glances during services that suggested private understanding. Small moments that individually meant nothing, but collectively created an impression of intimacy. Among those who noticed, opinions began forming. Some saw a woman finding spiritual guidance during a difficult season, a preacher fulfilling his pastoral responsibilities with compassion. Nothing more. Others saw boundaries becoming unclear, a relationship developing that existed in the gray space between appropriate and inappropriate, something that hadn't crossed a definitive line yet, but was moving dangerously close. Both interpretations existed simultaneously. Neither could be proven wrong because the evidence supported multiple conclusions. Do you think something wrong was happening here? Or do you think two people were just connecting on a deeper level and everyone around them was projecting suspicion? Comment your take, because the story hasn't crossed any definitive lines yet. But it's about to. Subscribe if you want to see what happens when those questions stop being theoretical. 2 years after their connection began, the weight of what she was feeling became impossible to ignore. She stopped being able to separate spiritual guidance from emotional dependence. Stopped being able to distinguish between the comfort of being understood and the pull of something more significant. In her mind, a future had begun forming, not clearly defined, not discussed openly, but present, a sense that this connection meant something beyond the present moment, that was leading somewhere. Whether that future existed in his mind as well remained unclear, because nothing about their closeness was publicly acknowledged. No boundaries were openly crossed in ways that could be named. No commitments were spoken aloud. Yet the familiarity grew, and by the time she realized the weight of what she was feeling, the story had already begun moving forward, without a clear point of return. What happens when you can't undo what's already been set in motion? When the feelings you've developed have consequences you didn't plan for? When the connection you thought was mutual turns out to exist only in your expectations? The next chapter reveals the decision she made, the one that changed everything, the one that divided everyone who knew her into opposing camps, and the one that started a chain of events no one could stop. Drop a comment with your prediction. Do you think she acted on what she was feeling? Or do you think she walked away? And subscribe, because what comes next makes this look simple. What you're about to hear is the moment everything stopped being theoretical. The moment decisions were made that couldn't be unmade. The moment a woman chose herself or threw everything away. Depending on who you ask, both versions will sound true. That's the problem. 22 months after the counseling sessions began, she made a decision that changed everything. She left her husband. Not temporarily. Not for a trial separation. She filed for divorce. 33 years of marriage ended with paperwork submitted on a Tuesday afternoon at the county courthouse. The separation was quiet. No public announcement. No dramatic confrontation that became neighborhood gossip. Just the legal dissolution of a partnership that had existed longer than some of the people discussing it had been alive. Some saw it as honesty. A woman finally choosing authenticity after decades of suppressing what she really wanted. A necessary break from a marriage that had stopped serving either person involved. Others saw it as disruption. The destruction of a covenant made before God and witnesses. A choice that seemed selfish, reckless, or influenced by someone she refused to name publicly. No single version satisfied everyone. Her ex-husband didn't contest the divorce. Some interpreted his acceptance as proof the marriage had already been dead, that he'd known for months or years that she'd emotionally left long before the legal paperwork made it official, that his lack of resistance was dignity, not defeat. Others interpreted it differently. Saw a man too shocked to fight, too hurt to argue. Someone who'd been blindsided by a decision his wife had been planning while he remained unaware. Both readings of his silence existed simultaneously. The divorce proceedings moved quickly. For months from filing to finalization. No prolonged custody battles. Their children were grown. No contested assets. They split everything with mechanical efficiency. The kind of divorce that looks clean on paper because all the damage happened internally. She moved into a small rental property across town. 1 bedroom, minimal furniture. The kind of place that suggests transition, not permanence. Her ex-husband remained in the house they'd shared for 3 decades. Alone. And her relationship with the preacher continued. After the divorce, her presence at church increased. She attended every service, arrived early, stayed late, volunteered for events with a frequency that made her unavoidable. She and the preacher were seen together often. Coffee after services, lunch occasionally, long conversations in his office that no longer appeared on any official schedule. But nothing was defined. No public acknowledgement of a relationship. No announcement that what people suspected had become reality. Just continued closeness that existed in the space between pastoral care, something more personal. Expectations formed without being spoken. In her private conversations with friends who still maintained contact, she referenced a future. Not explicitly, but in the way she talked about her life now versus her life before. About feeling seen for the first time in years. About connection that transcended normal definitions. She mentioned him constantly. His wisdom. His understanding. The way he'd helped her find herself again. Whether he was making similar statements to anyone remained unclear. Pause here for a second. If you've ever been in a situation where two people seem to have completely different understandings of what their relationship was, comment below. Because what's happening here is a gap forming between expectation and reality. And that gap is about to become a canyon. Feel like if you're seeing where this is going, and it's not anywhere good. 3 months after her divorce was finalized, the church leadership called a private meeting. They asked the preacher directly if there was a relationship developing that required disclosure. If the time he was spending with her had crossed from pastoral support into something that needed to be addressed formally. He said no, said he was providing spiritual guidance to someone navigating a difficult transition, reminded them that his calling was to serve people in crisis, not to abandon them when others became uncomfortable with the optics. Technically, he hadn't lied. There had been no formal declaration, no explicit commitment, nothing that could be pointed to as evidence of a romantic relationship. But the boundaries that typically exist between a spiritual leader and a congregant had become so unclear that their absence was more noticeable than their presence would have been. The leadership accepted his explanation, cautioned him about appearances, reminded him that perception mattered in his role, regardless of intent. He agreed to be more mindful. Nothing changed. She began referring to him differently, not as the preacher or pastor anymore, by his first name, with a familiarity that suggested intimacy beyond spiritual guidance. In private conversations, she spoke about their connection as something profound, something that existed on a level most people wouldn't understand. She talked about plans, not concrete plans with dates and logistics, but conceptual ones, about what life could look like moving forward, about partnership that honored both faith and authenticity. Her friends divided. Some supported what they saw as a woman finally finding happiness after years of quiet suffering, celebrated her courage to leave a marriage that hadn't served her, believed she deserved connection that felt genuine. Others distanced themselves, uncomfortable with what they perceived as justification for choices they couldn't reconcile with the faith they all claimed to share, concerned that she was building a future in her mind that didn't exist in reality. Both groups believed they were protecting her, just from different things. 7 months after her divorce was finalized, something happened that made everything more complicated. She discovered she was pregnant. The pregnancy was not publicly announced. Only a small number of people knew. Those who did know began asking questions that had no comfortable answers. She was 59 years old, postmenopausal by any reasonable medical assumption. The biological improbability of the situation raised immediate doubts, but medical documentation later confirmed it was real. The preacher's response was never made fully clear. What is known? No public acknowledgement came from him. No statement of responsibility. No plan announced to the congregation or to church leadership. No indication that he saw this development as requiring action on his part. Whether private conversations happened between them, only 2 people knew. But from the outside, his silence was deafening. 3 weeks after she confirmed the pregnancy, she was admitted to the hospital. Complications. That's the word used in the limited information that was shared. Medical complications that required immediate intervention. What followed changed the course of her life. She lost the pregnancy, but the consequences extended far beyond that loss. Severe hemorrhaging, emergency surgery that lasted hours, permanent physical damage that left her altered in ways she would never fully recover from. When she was discharged and returned home, she was different, not just physically. Her entire presence had changed. Let me ask you something. If someone goes through a medical crisis that results from a relationship that was never publicly acknowledged, who bears responsibility for what happened? The person who made the choice? The person who allowed the situation to develop? Both? Neither? Comment your answer. Because the next part of this story depends entirely on how you answer that question. And subscribe, because the next chapter is where everything falls apart in ways no one predicted. Friends who visited her after the hospital stay described her as hollow. She lost weight, moved slowly, carefully, as though her body was no longer something she trusted, spoke in shorter sentences, responded to questions with distant politeness that suggested she was present, but not really there. She stopped attending church, not gradually, immediately. 1 week she'd been there, involved, visible. The next week, absent. And the week after that. And the week after that. Her social media presence, which had been active, went silent for weeks. No posts, no comments, no responses to messages from people checking on her. Just silence that made people wonder, but not enough to show up at her door. Then, sporadic posts began appearing. Cryptic, references to betrayal without naming anyone. Questions about what people owe each other when promises are unspoken. Reflections on how isolation feels when it happens in a room full of people who claim to care. The tone wasn't angry. It was resigned, exhausted. The preacher maintained his duties without visible disruption. Services continued on schedule. His sermons remained well attended. If he was affected by what had happened to her, the pregnancy, the loss, the medical crisis, it wasn't apparent in his public life. He didn't visit her, didn't call, according to what she later shared with a few friends still in contact. Didn't acknowledge the situation in any way that suggested personal involvement. To the congregation, he remained the same steady presence he'd always been. To her, his silence was abandonment. 4 months after she lost the pregnancy, an announcement was made during Sunday service. The preacher was engaged to someone else, a woman from a neighboring congregation, someone he'd known. He explained to the assembled church for years. The relationship had developed recently, he said, naturally, with the blessing of both families and with careful prayer and discernment. The congregation responded with polite applause. Congratulations were offered. Plans for a wedding in the spring were discussed. Excitement rippled through the pews. She was not present for the announcement, but multiple people reached out to tell her within hours. Her response became the most debated part of the story. She sent messages, long, detailed, desperate messages, to him, to church leadership, to friends who distanced themselves months earlier. The content of those messages would later be analyzed, interpreted, and weaponized in arguments about what happened next. Some described the messages as heartbroken, the anguish of someone who'd lost everything based on expectations that turned out to be fantasies. Others described them as unhinged, obsessive, evidence of someone who'd built an entire future in her mind that had never existed in reality. A few described them as threatening, though what exactly was being threatened remained unclear. Reputation? Spiritual authority? Exposure of something that had been kept private? All three interpretations existed, often for people reading the exact same messages. She demanded a meeting with the preacher, privately, to discuss, she said, what was owed between them, what had been promised in the silence of those extended counseling sessions. What responsibility existed for the choices she'd made based on expectations he'd created, intentionally or not? The meeting happened at the church, in his office, the same office where 2 years of conversations had taken place, where boundaries had dissolved gradually enough that neither could identify the exact moment things changed. It lasted 90 minutes. No one else was present. What was said in that room? Only 2 people knew, and one of them would never get the chance to share a version. When she left that meeting, witnesses described her as calm, not upset, not crying, not visibly distressed, just calm in a way that made people uncomfortable because it seemed wrong given the circumstances. She drove home, sent 3 final messages to friends, short messages, thanking them for their support over the years. apologizing for becoming distant, expressing love, the kind of messages that only sound like goodbyes in hindsight. 3 days later, she was found dead. But before you continue, I need you to answer this. Do you think she ended her own life because the weight of what happened became unbearable? Or do you think something else happened in that 90-minute meeting that no one is talking about? Comment your theory, because the next chapter reveals what was found after her death. The note, the evidence, the questions that authorities couldn't answer, and the reasons why this story still hasn't been resolved. Subscribe now. The final chapter is where everyone picks a side, and no side is comfortable. When someone dies and leaves a note behind, does that automatically make it suicide? Or are there situations where the explanation is too convenient, too neat, too perfectly timed to protect the wrong people? What you're about to hear is the end of a story that never actually ended, because the official conclusion satisfied almost no one. And the questions that remain have divided people into camps that will never agree on what really happened. You'll have to decide which version you believe, or whether you believe any of them at all. She was found dead on a Thursday morning. A neighbor noticed her car hadn't moved in 3 days. Mail had piled up in the box by the street. The lights inside her rental house had stayed on continuously, visible through the windows at all hours, which was unusual for someone who typically maintained predictable routines. The neighbor called the landlord. The landlord performed a welfare check, and that's when she was found. Authorities were called immediately. They arrived within 12 minutes, secured the scene, began the initial investigation that would determine whether what happened required further scrutiny. According to the preliminary report, there were no immediate signs of struggle. No forced entry, no evidence of a physical altercation, no defensive wounds, nothing that suggested violence had occurred in that small one-bedroom rental property. She was found in her bedroom, on the bed, fully clothed, positioned in a way that appeared peaceful, according to the officer's description. The initial conclusion seemed obvious to those who responded, but then they found her laptop. The laptop was open on the small desk in the corner of the bedroom, still powered on. The screen displayed a document that had been saved 3 days earlier, the same day as her meeting with the preacher. It was a note, not handwritten, typed, approximately 400 words, addressed to no one specifically, but clearly meant to be read. The content of that note became the most analyzed piece of evidence in the entire case. It spoke of exhaustion, of shame that felt inescapable, of choices made with hope that turned into consequences she couldn't undo, of feeling trapped between a past she destroyed and a future that had never actually existed. To some who read it, the note read like a goodbye, the clear articulation of someone who'd reached a breaking point and saw no path forward, evidence of severe emotional distress that culminated in a decision to end her suffering. To others, it raised more questions than it answered. The note was detailed, specific about feelings, but vague about events. It mentioned promises that were never spoken, but always implied. It referenced expectations created by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. It talked about medical consequences that changed everything without naming what those consequences were or who bore responsibility for them. It expressed pain, regret, isolation, but it didn't explicitly state intent to die. Some investigators noted this absence as significant. Others argued that suicidal ideation doesn't always announce itself clearly, that the overall tone was sufficient to indicate someone in crisis who'd made the decision to end their life. Both interpretations fit the evidence. There were other details that made people uncomfortable. The timing. 3 days after a 90-minute private meeting with a preacher. 3 days after an engagement announcement that upended whatever future she'd imagined. 3 days during which she'd sent final messages to friends that read like closure. The method was never officially disclosed, but information leaked through unofficial channels suggested prescription medication. A significant quantity, enough to be intentional, not accidental. But there's what made people question: the medication wasn't prescribed to her. Stop right here and think about this. If someone dies from medication that wasn't prescribed to them, does that automatically mean they obtained it themselves with intent to die? Or does it mean someone else provided it? Comment your immediate reaction, because the investigation had to answer this exact question, and the answer they arrived at didn't satisfy everyone. Hit subscribe before we go further. The next part reveals what authorities found when they started asking harder questions. Investigators examined her phone records, her text messages, her email correspondence, her search history, her financial transactions in the weeks leading up to her death. They found extensive communication with a preacher, messages that confirmed the relationship had been far more personal than he'd acknowledged to church leadership, conversations that referenced future plans, emotional intimacy, and expectations of commitment. They also found messages to friends expressing confusion about where the relationship stood, questions about whether she'd misunderstood what was happening between them, concerns that she'd sacrificed everything for something that had never been real. Her search history revealed inquiries about legal options, whether spiritual leaders could be held accountable for emotional manipulation, whether promises made in private without witnesses carried any weight. But nothing in her search history suggested research into methods of suicide. No searches for lethal doses of medication. No visits to forums discussing self-harm. This absence struck some investigators as notable. Others argued it meant nothing, that someone determined to end their life doesn't always research methodology. But the absence of digital evidence didn't disprove intent. The preacher was interviewed twice. First as a witness, someone who'd had recent contact with the deceased. Then as a person of interest, someone whose relationship with her required clarification. He cooperated fully, according to official reports, answered questions, provided his phone voluntarily, allowed investigators to review messages between them. His statement was consistent. He provided pastoral counseling. The relationship had become closer than typical pastor-congregant dynamics, which he acknowledged was a mistake in judgment. But nothing inappropriate had occurred. No romantic relationship. No promises of a future together. No encouragement for her to leave her marriage. He admitted the pregnancy, said it had been unexpected and complicated, said they discussed options privately, and she'd made her own decisions about how to proceed. He characterized the 90-minute meeting 3 days before her death as her seeking closure. Said she'd been upset about his engagement, but he'd explained that their connection had always been spiritual support, nothing more. Said she'd seemed disappointed but accepting when she left. His description painted her as someone who'd misread the nature of their relationship, who'd built expectations that existed only in her mind. Many people found his account credible. A spiritual leader maintaining appropriate boundaries with someone who'd become emotionally dependent on him. Others found it suspiciously convenient. A narrative that absolved him of all responsibility while placing blame entirely on her perception. Messages between them told a more complicated story than his statement suggested. Investigators found texts where he'd used language that suggested romantic interest, references to missing her, to thinking about her constantly, to feeling connected in ways he couldn't explain to others. But they also found messages where he'd maintained distance, reminded her of his role, emphasized the importance of appropriate boundaries. Both types of messages existed, sometimes in the same conversation, creating a pattern that could be interpreted multiple ways depending on which messages were prioritized. Friends who knew her described someone who'd been genuinely convinced a future existed, who'd talked about plans as though they were mutual decisions, Hood believed, based on years of interaction, that leaving her marriage was a step towards something real. Friends who knew him described someone who'd been trying to help someone in crisis, who'd perhaps been too available, too personally invested in her well-being, but who'd never crossed definitive lines or made promises he didn't intend to keep. Both groups were describing the same relationship, but from perspectives so different they might as well have been describing different people entirely. Here's the question that split everyone who followed this case. Can you be responsible for someone's death without ever intending harm? Without ever explicitly doing anything wrong? Just by allowing them to believe something that wasn't true? Drop your answer in the comments, because this is the question that made some people demand charges and others insist there was nothing to charge. After 6 weeks of investigation, authorities released their findings. The death was ruled suicide. Contributing factors included recent divorce, medical trauma, social isolation, and untreated depression. No evidence of foul play was found. No evidence that anyone other than the deceased had been present in the home at the time of death. No evidence that the medication had been provided by another person with intent to cause harm. The case was closed. For many, this conclusion made sense. A woman who'd made drastic life changes based on a relationship that didn't develop as she'd hoped, who'd experienced medical trauma that left her physically and emotionally devastated, who'd been isolated from support systems and overwhelmed by circumstances she couldn't reverse. Suicide wasn't just plausible. It was the most logical explanation for all available evidence. But for others, the official conclusion left too many questions unanswered. Rumors spread quickly after the case was closed. Some believed the note, while genuine in expressing her emotional state, wasn't intended as a suicide note, that she'd been processing her feelings in writing, something she'd done frequently according to friends, not planning her death. They questioned how she'd obtained medication that wasn't prescribed to her, pointed out that no evidence of purchase or procurement was ever found, suggested the possibility that someone had provided it, claiming it would help her sleep or manage anxiety, without disclosing the risk. They emphasized the timing, that her death occurred days after a meeting where only 2 people were present, that it occurred right as she'd begun making inquiries about accountability and consequences for spiritual leaders who abused their authority. They suggested her death was convenient, that it silenced someone who could have caused significant damage to her reputation, that it ended a situation before it could become a public scandal that destroyed a ministry. Some went further, theorized that the meeting had involved pressure, threats disguised as spiritual guidance, manipulation that pushed someone already fragile into a decision they wouldn't have made otherwise. A few suggested outright murder, that someone had staged a suicide using knowledge gained through years of private counseling sessions, that the note had been coerced or edited, that the scene had been arranged to look like something it wasn't. These theories were never substantiated. No evidence emerged that supported them beyond speculation and suspicion. But they persisted. The church split over what to believe. Some members defended the preacher completely, saw him as a man who tried to help someone in crisis and was now being blamed for her mental health struggles, who'd maintained appropriate boundaries even when she hadn't, who'd done nothing wrong except care too much. They pointed to his continued ministry, his engagement and subsequent marriage, his clean record before and after, the lack of any evidence suggesting intentional harm. Others left the congregation entirely, saw his narrative as self-serving, believed he'd created a situation where a vulnerable woman made life-altering decisions based on expectations he'd knowingly cultivated, that he'd abandoned her when the consequences became inconvenient. They pointed to the messages, the pregnancy, the medical crisis, his silence during her suffering, his engagement announcement mere months after she'd lost everything. A third group remained uncertain, saw elements of truth in both perspectives, believed the situation was more complicated than either clear condemnation or complete exoneration allowed. All three groups had access to the same information. All reached entirely different conclusions. No charges were ever filed. No official acknowledgement of wrongdoing beyond poor judgment in maintaining appropriate boundaries. The preacher continued his ministry for 2 more years before accepting a position at a larger church in another state. He's still preaching today. Her ex-husband sold the house they'd shared and moved closer to where their children had settled. He's never spoken publicly about what happened. The rental property where she died has been occupied by 3 different tenants since. None stayed longer than 8 months. And online, in forums and comment sections and private groups, people still argue about what really happened. So here's what I need you to answer. Do you think she took her own life because the weight of what she'd lost became unbearable? Or do you think someone helped her disappear because her existence had become a problem? And if it was pressure that killed her, social, emotional, spiritual, who applied it? Was it the preacher who allowed her to believe something that wasn't real? Was it the church community who judged her decisions without offering support? Was it her own choices, made with hope but without guarantee? Or was it all of them, collectively creating circumstances that became impossible to survive? Some believe she made choices that led her there. Some believe she was failed by everyone she trusted. Some believe the truth was buried with her. There was no resolution, only theories, and a story that still refuses to settle. Comment below with your verdict. Not what you hope happened, what you actually believe happened based on everything you just heard. Was this suicide? Murder? Something in between that doesn't have a name? And if you believe someone is responsible beyond her, say who and why. Subscribe to True Crime Files HQ because stories like this, where nothing is clear and everyone is certain, are exactly what we cover here. Hit that notification bell. The next case drops in 3 days, and it's just as unresolved as this one. The line between victim and participant is never as clear as we want it to be. And sometimes the truth isn't hidden. It's just impossible to agree on. I'm your host, Christian, and as always, until next time.